Good morning. I can't even believe you all are here at 9 a.m. in LA. Give yourselves a round of applause. I think one of the things that's, for me, been so transformative about these past 2 days, yes, the panels have been great, the conversation has been wonderful, but it really is just being able to be in the presence of, thank you, being able to be in the presence of brilliant, creative female storytellers. We don't often get to congregate like this, and so every time I get in a room, I love to suck up whatever energy and wisdom I can gain from my peers, and certainly from people who have been wildly successful women storytellers. And so I'm honored today to be able to do that with Nina Jacobson. Nina is quite literally a force. And also her company is called Color Force, but she's been a force in Hollywood for over 30 years. As an executive at Disney, also as a producer now, running her own company, Color Force. She is behind such franchises as Diary of a Wimpy Kid, small films like The Sixth Sense, and one that you may have heard of, Hunger Games. And out of all of those, my absolute favorite, the American Crime Story series, and if you're not familiar with it, did anybody see the O.J. Simpson, the first season of it? That's because of Nina. So in addition to all of this work, she's got such a diverse body of work. She's also been very vocal and outspoken her entire career about the need for and her own commitment to increased inclusion, inclusivity, diversity in entertainment, both behind the camera, in front of the camera, and everywhere that she goes. So I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you today, Nina. Let's give Nina a round of applause for being here. All right, so my first question to you actually has to do with why you're even here at a podcast festival, and it's because I hear you are obsessed with podcasts, right?
Yes.
Okay, so tell me what you love right now. Like, what are you loving and listening to? And then in general, I want to know why you love podcasts so much. How has that, if at all, informed your work?
Well, okay, that's why I brought my phone out here. I thought I would have to maybe have a quick peek at what's currently on tap. On my way over, I listened, just on my drive today. I mean, part of why I love them is because I live in LA, so I'm in my car a lot.
Yep.
And I'm a very, a restless mind, and I just have a kind of nonstop appetite to hear stories, to hear smart people, to just, I'm an omnivore. So right now, every day I listen to The Daily without fail. Every night I'll listen to the Rachel Maddow, podcast version of her show. And I often just prefer listening. I don't know, I when it comes to news and things like that, the listening just is, I can do it when I'm walking my dog. I can do it when I'm I can do it when I'm, in the kitchen or, running from one place to the next, and certainly in my car.
And when you say prefer, you mean over watching?
Yeah,
right?
like when it comes to an interview format or a news format, and even some of the storytelling. Obviously I love movies, I love television, but there's a certain pleasure to audible experiences, and I listen to a lot of audiobooks. But right now I would say I'm obsessed with Ear Hustle, which I love.
Ear Hustle fans.
I love Reply All, Radio Lab. I just listened to Stay Tuned with Preet this morning on my way in.
One fan, yes.
Yeah.
Yay.
Criminal. Criminal's fantastic. And then I'll go specific for the Lawfare podcast if they have something that's interesting to me. And then some of the things that are not in season right now that I love Accused, Crime Town. We're actually doing as a, we are developing it as a TV series at FX. I listened to Missing Richard Simmons. I listened to Mogul, which I loved. S-Town, obviously, and I actually
just,
my son and I devoured The Unexplainable Disappearance of Mars Patel, which I thought was an incredible narrative podcast. So that's a few. That's just
that's more than a few that you love podcasts, which is amazing. But okay, so you said you like listening to them because, first of all, you prefer listening, right? The audible experience. But what about it has informed your work as a storyteller in a visual medium?
Well, I think for one, just great storytelling is great storytelling, and for what I do, I just need a lot of stimulation, just as a person, but also like that Yes song, don't surround yourself with yourself. It's very easy when you are immersed in production and development that all you're reading are scripts, all you're watching is, kind of what you have to be watching. And just pulling in like new ideas, new thoughts, new ideas of characters, new ideas of sort of storytelling techniques, all of that, it keeps me fresh, and I draw from it when I'm trying to solve. We spend a lot of time as a dramaturg, in my job. I've spent quite a bit of time giving notes on scripts, giving notes on what I've read or seen, and I find that if I can like sort of pull from different, media, different, completely different subjects, but that kind of cross-pollination just sort of keeps me inspired and helps me to sometimes, you might find an idea for a solution for something you're working on from a very unlikely place.
So you said, good storytelling is good storytelling no matter the medium. But I'm curious to know, when you listed off, just a handful of the podcasts that you're listening to, and then you said there was one that you're actually in the process of developing. Which one was it?
Crime Town.
Crime Town. So in the process of developing that, how do you know of all the good stories and the good storytelling that you consume, which are the stories that you should be telling, right? Because there's good, and then there's right for you, and right for your both your voice, your point of view, and even your investment. How do you make that decision?
Well, with something like Crime Town, it has a great protagonist for one. So obviously, when you're looking at adaptation, you're always looking for, well, how am I going to sustain this? Whether it's 2 hours or 10 hours, or could be 5 seasons of a show. So you're looking for character dynamics, a character premise, basically, that is sustainable. And so, something like Ear Hustle, which I love, I know it'll fit in somewhere. I mean, what I find with Ear Hustle is that the humanity of these guys who are,
Describe Ear Hustle for those who don't know.
Ear Hustle is made at San Quentin Prison, and it is a collaboration between the woman who's brought this podcast to San Quentin, and then she has her co-producer and partner is a prisoner, and then they have subject matter that for each one about questions that people have or questions that they want to explore about life behind bars. And what is so striking in hearing the voices of these really now invisible men is just their humanity, their complexity, their likability, the longing, the things that they care about, and it just you'll never look at a prison story the same again. And the question of mass incarceration you think of in completely different terms just by getting to know these guys. So something like that just sort of informs me overall. And I know that somehow it's going to fit in, but I don't know how. Something like Crime Town, it had a sort of sustainable character premise, this kind of collision course in some ways between the mayor of Providence and the mob boss of Providence. I went to college in Providence, so we know the way that town worked. And we felt like there was enough there that we, in terms of a cast of characters and how they all kind of kept complicating each other's lives, that we'd be able to sustain a series based on it.
So it sounds like most, and I know not all, but most of your calculation really is about the quality of the story and how you'll be able to tell it, and not necessarily as much as one might assume with you being a Hollywood executive about necessarily the market, right, or the audience, or how much does that come into play?
I'm a big believer that, if something doesn't just grab me, like the first and foremost, the book you can't put down, the script you can't put down, the podcast you can't stop listening to, any story that is irresistible. If I've had that reaction, I have to extrapolate and hope that other people will too, and that the more, oftentimes I think the more individual something is, the more universal it is. The more you try to please people, the less people you please. And so I don't I do think about, well, who would go see it? But I don't think about that first. I actually mostly think about the subjective experience of, I can't get this off my mind. And the sort of human storytelling relationship, and if it brought me to the campfire, chances are it'll bring other people too.
Oh, I like that, if it brought you to the campfire. So then part of your role then, after identifying the great story, is a part of it is then identifying who are the right voices to tell that story. And so I know for the third season of American Crime Story, you're looking at a particular narrative in and around Hurricane Katrina. And I read that you specifically looked for Black writers from the South, right, to fill up your writer's room. How important is diversity and equality? I mean, to me, that seems like an obvious and a no-brainer. And yet, most of us know that when we look at content, we see stories that are written about women that don't have women in the writer's room, or stories that are written about people of color that don't have people of color in the writer's room. How important is it for you that that be a part of all of your projects?
Well, it's hugely important, because ultimately, you can certainly immerse yourself in research, you can immerse yourself in asking questions, but ultimately, again, that subjective experience, we each walk in the world in our own way, and there is no way for a white person to understand what it is to walk in the world as a not white person. They're just not. And there is no way to really understand what an OJ means or a Katrina means to the Black community if you don't have voices who can sort of speak a truth about that themselves. Something, at the same time, the challenge is that something like we're about to go into production on a show called Pose, which is set in the, ballroom scene in the 80s. The world of Paris is burning, the ballroom scene of, trans, kind of, the houses that compete against each other. And the people who originated that story are cisgender men.
Okay.
But then we had to go and find as many voices as we could to bring in who we knew that obviously on camera we would have trans people, but it's not enough for it to be on camera. So then we had to go and recruit. But where it gets challenging is that when you need your sort of senior writer, Hollywood tends to be a backwards-facing loop. So you're looking for people who have done something great before. That you can say, oh, I loved, the movie they directed. I loved the script that they wrote that turned into this show or that movie. And so since so many of those positions have historically been occupied by white men, it's hard to get the experienced person necessarily. There are some, but they are really in huge demand. And especially right now, where finally, at least there's some traction on the fact that there's an enormous market and appetite for more diverse and inclusive storytelling. A lot of the most seasoned people of color who are head writers, for instance, for a TV show, they're all spoken for. They're telling their own stories, they're doing their own thing, and so you're having to break new talent and bring them up in the system in hopes that they will become that person, but sometimes you still get stuck with kind of, the people who've done it before not necessarily being as diverse a group as you wish that they were, because so many of those folks are spoken for.
Yeah, I mean, I think that conundrum, which I firmly believe is solvable, but it's true for many industries and not just Hollywood, right? That because white men have run most things into the ground for a very, very long time, right? For a very, very long time. And so you're having to find new talent and open doors and provide opportunities for folks who are, I think, ready and talented and willing and just need that opportunity. But you said, kind of we're in this moment right now when diversity is in. And I'll even say when the conversation about diversity is in, right?
Exactly.
Of all types, whether you're talking about racial and ethnic, sexual orientation, gender identity, all of that is hot right now. And part of me is excited, right? I love turning on the television and seeing Issa Rae. I love having all of these options. And yet, even though I am a millennial, I remember television in the 90s, right? And the 90s, you had this kind of diversity of stories that were being told, and then it disappeared. So the cynic in me sometimes feels like, this is just a cycle. This is a wave, people are feeling real nice, and then it'll disappear. you have your own perspective and vantage point from where you sit and having seen Hollywood and knowing what's happening now. I'm curious, what excites you about kind of the trend towards diversity, but if anything, what might concern you or make you cautious about it?
I mean, I don't think that this one, I don't think it's going to go away this time. I think that, for one, all of these great voices are being found and nurtured, and there are people like Ryan Murphy who's really walking the walk and not just talking the talk. He has, the Half Foundation. Every set of a show that we're doing together, he's committed that half of the directors who he hires will be, and personnel, but particularly on the writing and directing side, will be either women, people of color, or, not straight. And so that opens the door to sort of a training of a next generation. But beyond that, these voices that are emerging, they now become those people who, when you're looking for somebody who's done something great, next year, the year after, you have Issa Rae or, Melina Matsoukas or whoever it is to now you can look at a body of work. But beyond that, I also just think that the marketplace is proving people are sort of tired of the same old, same old. You can't just keep, especially on the film side where, television is really challenging film to be as original as television is right now, to be as surprising as television is right now. And so you can't just keep churning out the same old, same old. And so, something like Crazy Rich Asians, a movie we just finished production on and that we're in post on now, it feels incredibly fun and fresh to see an all-Asian cast in a big mainstream romantic comedy. It just feels like that's the reason to go to theater. I haven't seen that movie before. It doesn't feel like the umpteenth iteration of something I've seen a million times before. So I think that the appetite is there. And the successes are there. I mean, something like Hidden Figures was one of the most successful movies of its year. And, the number, something like Straight Outta Compton, these movies also blow up some of the traditional mindset the studios had. I just talked about this the other day at a panel, which is when I was coming up, I was told that, don't you know that girls will identify with a male protagonist, but boys won't identify with a female protagonist. As though this was some sort of a scientifically known fact.
Of course.
And that's why you could cast a boy or a young man, and girls will identify with him. But if you cast a girl or a young woman, that would not, or a woman, it wouldn't work the other way. Of course, that's not really just not true. And it's been proven to be not true over and over again. But every time we prove it, people act surprised, like it's a new news flash. But now you have, some of the most profitable movies of the last 5-10 years are driven by women in front of the camera, or say something like the other conventional wisdom, black movies don't travel. Tell that to the folks who are cashing their checks from Straight Outta Compton.
Right. I love that. So let me ask you, you mentioned the word surprising, and when you said surprising, my ears perked up a little bit, because I think sometimes we see storytellers and successful people in general, not just women, but just people who are, traditionally successful as kind of hitting a point in their life and career where they know it all, right? You have all the answers. Right, you clearly don't feel that way. No. What surprises you on a daily basis, or not even on a daily basis? What has surprised you recently in your role, in this kind of journey of telling stories? What's new or interesting now about your work and about the industry?
Definitely. The reason I actually ended up getting into movies in the first place was that when I was in college, when I started studying film theory, it was the first thing I'd ever started to study where the more I learned, the less I knew. And that there was just sort of this bottomless pit of things you could watch, things you could read, things you could think about, things that you thought you understood but that you don't, or that you might look at it in a different way. And again, I think it's part of my love of podcasts. It's just like all of these different voices, these different perspectives. But I would say that, on the one hand, what has surprised me is, the degree to which, for one, audiences, especially in the TV space, they don't care where they're getting the story from. If it interests them, they'll find it. They don't care if it's on Hulu. They don't care if it's a podcast versus a YouTube. Interesting stories are finding their audiences, and yet and they couldn't be more different. And yet they have also this sort of common thread of, which is the thing I always ask myself every time. And it's funny because as long as I've done this, I only sort of had this like breakthrough epiphany about what I'm kind of a standard to meet on everything that I work on, which is I always ask myself these two questions. What do I want and what do I fear? If I want or fear something during the course of a story, I'm totally engaged. I'm all in. If I get to a place where I don't know what to want and I don't know what to be afraid of, don't open that door, don't go on that date.
I was just about to ask you for an example when you say what you want and what you fear.
So
what does that look like in a story?
So you look at, I mean, I just take if you take a movie like Beauty and the Beast, let's say, you deeply want for them to connect. You want him to stop being such a jerk so that they can connect and find each other. And you are incredibly afraid of the sort of, rage of the townspeople who are going to come and tear them apart and destroy him, right? And those two feelings, you're never without them. You're never without desire or fear. And so bringing that sort of standard to any kind of great storytelling, I mean, even like, let's say something like S-Town, you want him to sort of find his people, and you want to solve this crime. You're afraid that people are going to to exploit him. You always have a vested interest, and so I guess I'm surprised by how much that is true, no matter what it is that I'm taking in, and how. And also, let's say, the kind of eclectic nature and hungry nature of an audience to find stories that speak to them, regardless of medium. They don't care what channel, they don't care what studio, they don't care really even what medium. They just want things to speak to them.
Yeah. So we've talked about, I would almost categorize this conversation into two different topics. One is we've talked a lot about storytelling, your creative process. And then the other, we've talked about diversity and inclusion and representation. And they all sound very nice and neat and simple here when you're talking about them on a panel. But on a day-to-day basis and in practice, there's risk involved in both of those things. There's risk involved in telling deeply personal stories. And I mean, frankly, there's risk involved in putting that much money into telling these stories. And there's risk involved in kind of pushing the limits around diversity and inclusion. So, and I think the fear, you mentioned fear, I think fear stops a lot of people from doing both of those things. Fear stops people from creating and telling great stories, a story that is like burning inside of them. And fear also stops people from kind of stepping out on a limb and doing what they know is right for an issue that they care about or community that they care about. So I want to ask you, having done both, what's a time where you got it wrong?
I think that got which part wrong?
Take your pick. So either, oh my gosh, I thought this was the right story for me to tell. I thought it was great, and man, it just wasn't. Or I was doing my best to like really carry the banner here, the torch for diversity and inclusion, and I screwed up so bad.
The main thing that I do think there is a lot of fear, by the way, and I think that, I was talking to a kind of a colleague of mine at one point about this, which is that I think, they're in creative, in sort of a collective creative enterprise, there's actually should be a lot of healthy, respectful friction, a lot of push and pull, back and forth. And And I think that oftentimes that people are more comfortable knowing that they're going to have fights, arguments, and they can all be done with respect, but you're going to have a lot of push and pull. People are often more comfortable having it with somebody who looks like them. And because they're afraid that they're going to say the wrong thing, they're going to ask the wrong question, they're going to step in it. They're going to inadvertently be accused of being a sexist if it's a guy, of being a racist if it's a white person. And that fear of being that I'm going to somehow be politically incorrect actually ends up holding people back from, go ahead, make some mistakes. It's better to make some mistakes and ask some dumb questions than to be afraid to take that.
Say it for the people in the back, Nina.
But I mean, I would say, you know, a case of sort of realizing that we had gone astray was something like Katrina. We put together an incredible room on the first iteration of Katrina. Amazing people. We set out to be inclusive. We set out to make sure that we told as much as we could the full complexity of the story.
And this is writer's room you're talking
the
about?
The writer's room for
okay.
Katrina. Yes, exactly. Sorry, yeah. And then we were ready to go. I mean, it was supposed to be the second season of the show. And we had cast it. We were gearing up to go into a hard pre-production. And we just looked at it and we were like, you know, it's not as personal as we want it to be. It's not as complex as we want it to be. It's not as hard as we have tried. It's not as compelling. I don't know that it's not as good as it has to be. No matter how right the process might have been, if it's not good enough, if it's not compelling enough, then we're not doing justice to it at all. And we had to do the really painful thing of calling people and saying, sorry, but we're not going to go. We're not going to do it now. We're going to pull forward Versace, which is ready to go.
That's now the second season.
Now
the
this is
show's
the
going to be
second
about
season,
Versace.
and we're going to reconceive our approach to make it more personal, more intimate, to focus on this book, 5 Days at Memorial, which is sort of a microcosm of the larger Katrina story, and it touches on all of the same themes and ideas, but it does so in a way that is really intimate, really character-based, really challenging, and that felt, our best 2 episodes that we had were those 2. And we were
that
like,
were of this smaller story within the broader Katrina narrative. Take me back to the moment when you made the decision that, this ain't gonna work and we gotta pull back, right? Because that's a big deal.
It was huge. It was really hard. It was very hard. You know, we were lucky to have partners who trusted us because it's hard. It's very painful. It's embarrassing to say, sorry, I know you think you're doing this next, to an actor you have, contracted with. But ultimately, the making something that you know isn't as good as it should be, could be, has to be. No matter what the expense of not doing it is, the expense of doing it is greater, not just because it may or may not succeed, but because you're trying to build a brand and a brand equity. And you want to make sure that people know when they watch this show, it's going to challenge them and it's going to push them. And that, but it was hard. It was a tough call to make, and a bunch of tough calls. And that's not to say that the room that we will now put together in the reboot won't be also an inclusive room.
Right.
But we had a wonderful group of people, and we disbanded and started over.
So how do you know, in the end, when it's all said and done with a particular film project or TV project, any creative endeavor, how do you, Nina, when you go home, decide that was a success for me?
I want it to matter. I want it to matter. It takes an enormous amount of time, money, energy. It takes me away from my family. And if something mattered, if it mattered to, I oftentimes think about, because I have kids, I think about, with Crazy Rich Asians, I think about what it'll be like for an Asian girl to drive down the street on her way to school and see a big giant poster for a Hollywood movie with somebody who looks like her. With something like OJ, for people to say, I hated Marsha Clark, I hated Chris Darden, or I hated Johnny Cochran, but now I kind of get them, or I was surprised that there was more to that than I thought. Anytime that you kind of give people an emotional access to something that they, and a compassion for people that they might not otherwise have it for, that feels like it matters. Anytime that you give, for a little girl to look up to Katniss Everdeen, or for, a guy to realize that I want to be her. When it matters, then it feels like a success. Sometimes hopefully it's a financial success. Sometimes something might matter and it doesn't necessarily succeed at the level you wish it did. But then because you're going to make mistakes. And so if you're going to make mistakes, you still want to know that it mattered.
What's one thing, so you're now speaking to an audience of creators of some kind, right? Whether they are themselves podcasters, producers, engineers, or people who are just tangentially connected to the industry of creating and storytelling. What's one piece of advice that you would give this room, in particular a room full of women who are in various stages of this journey of being storytellers and creators in the world? What's one piece of advice you would tell them?
That's a good question. I think that the thing I strive for is kind of a balance between conviction and, the courage to have your own voice, to say what you think and be able to articulate it and reach people with what you have to say in any given room, in any given creative endeavor, with as great of a humility and receptivity, that there is a strength in receptivity that I think women fundamentally understand. And
what do you mean by receptivity when you say that?
Being able to accept that the best idea might come from any quarter, that in any conversation, in any debate, there is a 50-50 chance that you are wrong. You might be right, you might be wrong, and your position doesn't make you any more likely to be right. You can be the most senior person in the room, you can be the most powerful person in the room. It doesn't mean that you're any more likely to be right. The person who might have the best idea, that's the idea, the free market economy of ideas, that's what should prevail. And so ultimately, being able to listen to your own voice, but actually also have a great interest in the voice of others, I think is something women do understand. It's something that women can, it's a balancing act because it's very easy to be afraid to be outspoken, afraid to be, that kind of girl. And you gotta be that kind of girl. But you can still be that kind of girl and be able to let somebody else prevail because you actually think that what they had to say made sense and was the more compelling solution or the more compelling way to tell that story.
Well, Nina, thank you for being compelling, for having a lot to say, and for being that kind of girl today. I really appreciate the conversation. And thank you all so much.
Thank you.